Good afternoon. I'm one of your hosts today, Steve Fleck. On behalf of Chapel Hill Alliance for a Livable Town, aka CHALT, I'd like to welcome you to the first of two seminars that focus on the affordable housing crisis. One of CHALT's primary missions is to host a speaker series and to bring programs that serve a community need. We work to educate ourselves about town council policy decisions and often take positions focused on building and maintaining a healthy, inclusive, and livable community. You can learn more at the website chalt.org. A lack of affordable housing constitutes a durable and growing challenge for Chapel Hill, as for so many other localities. Today, we'll look at some of the dynamics that contribute to this problem. Next week's program will look at some possible solutions. And here's the agenda that we're going to cover today. Julie or Savannah, agenda, please. It should be up in a second. Virginia Gray in purple has volunteered to be timekeeper for our speakers and to keep things moving so we can conclude at 5:30. Just a few reminders while the agenda is being sought. First, this webinar is being recorded. The recording will be sent to all enrollees. Here we are. Excuse me while I get back to where I can read my little text. The recording will be sent to all enrollees and you'll be able to add comments at that time too if we can't get them in today. You'll be able to use the chat function to write questions to our speakers. We'll try to address them as time permits following each talk. You can direct your question to one or both speakers, but please use the everyone choice in chat so that everyone can see your questions. We'll reserve comments for part 3, the facilitated discussion time, which will be directed by Julie. And now I need to introduce my co-host, Linda Brown, who's really the chief impetus behind this webinar. Linda retired from a long and distinguished academic career as an innovative educator in Baltimore area schools and universities, in addition to working as a community activist. Among the latter activities, she served as a board member of her Beverly Hills Improvement Association. That's Maryland 21214, in case you need to watch it, which helped initiate redevelopment in Northeast Baltimore. And she was a founding member and steering committee member of the Northeast Housing Initiative Community Land Trust, which develops permanently affordable for sale housing. Since moving here in 2018, her deep concerns about affordable housing and environmental justice have prompted her to work with CHALT. And now Linda will take it away to introduce the webinar and our first speaker.
Thank you, Steve. My friend Peter Sabonis is really a jack of all trades. He is the Director of Human Rights Development at Partners for Dignity and Rights. An attorney with the Maryland Legal Aid Bureau in 2010, he helped lead it to adopt human rights framework for its statewide advocacy. With a combination of his community organizing skills and skills related to law and public policy, Peter works with community groups to promote human rights-based economic and community development. Peter co-founded the Homeless Persons Representation Project, a legal aid program, and United Workers, a multiracial community organizing human rights group. He is a member of a Baltimore Community Land Trust and part of Share Baltimore and CLT Network. He was a primary writer and editor of the Baltimore-based report, Community Plus Land Plus Trust, Tools for Development Without Displacement. Most recently, he co-authored Developing Deeply Affordable Community-Controlled Housing, a toolkit for community activists and allied developers. Digital copies of both publications are included in the resource list we have provided for you just under the agenda. Peter, thank you so very much for joining us.
Thank you, Linda. Everybody can hear me? Thumbs up? Yeah, okay, good. I'm here to present how we got here. And I think that the resource list is a wonderful exploration of that and a chronicle of that. And I thought that perhaps the easiest way to present this, since I have a little gray hair and long in the tooth, is perhaps also track how I got here, because I think that actually is a parallel track, and that started really very much with a faith commitment to get into justice work, and which really got me involved with the homeless early on, while I was in law school, right after law school, and really with just a basic service level mentality. No sense of structures and systemic problems, et cetera. And I heard a discussion one time by anthropologist Kim Hooper, who was putting together a study on homeless folks in the late 80s. And he had this wonderful story that illustrated this juxtaposition between the personal and the systemic, where he asked a homeless guy, how long have you been homeless? And he says, about 2 years. Why are you homeless? Well, I'm homeless because I'm an alcoholic. Well, how long have you been an alcoholic? Oh, about 10 years. Oh, okay. Well, tell me about the first 8 years. Well, I would find a place, I'd drink, I'd get drunk, I'd get kicked out. Then I'd find another place, and I'd drink, I get drunk, and I get kicked out again. And Kim Hooper says, all right, well, but what's been going on the last 2 years since you've been homeless? He says, well, I can't find another place to live. I can't afford it. And this is just the you know, to me, it was an example of how the studies about homelessness at the time were so focused on the personal characteristics of folks who were on the streets, their mental illness, their substance abuse, their trauma history, to explain their homelessness. But we're back burnering the conversions of cheap rental housing to condominiums and market value housing that was going on in a lot of cities in the late 80s. We lost 4.5 million units of affordable housing stock during that time, from 73 to 83, through demolition or structural conversion. Rental rehab expenditures, basically upgrading your rentals. If you were a landlord, they doubled from 1982 to 86 compared to the prior 12 years. And essentially this improved and upgraded housing was priced out of the range of the alcoholic that Kim was talking to, and also priced out of the range of folks who were working poor or at the edge of that. Because we entered a period there where real wages, that is wages not adjusted for inflation, did not increase for decades. And meanwhile, housing prices did increase, and the sort of conversions that were most acutely felt in major urban areas were also occurring at the time. At the time also was a pullback in federal aid. In federal housing assistance, public housing monies were reduced. Now, this started even in the Carter administration. Reagan gets a lot of criticism for this, but this kind of neoliberal, moderate, democratic perspective started earlier than that. And we started withdrawing public housing subsidies, switching over to vouchers, withdrawing money from that too, or cutting back on that. And cutting back on community development block grant monies, federal monies for that, federal monies for the home program. And we, at that time, as a homeless advocate who was with a number of other advocates and understanding that we had this individual issue with that my clients had, or personal issues, but that were operating in this structural context. You know, we'd spend a lot of time yelling at the federal government to increase their subsidies, yelling at the state and local government to make up for those subsidies, and winning a few battles, but not many. Basically, it was getting the scraps from the rich man's table, so to speak. And meanwhile, I was directed by some of my more structurally thinking colleagues to what the city and the state were spending money on. And it did seem like I was spending a lot of time on the business pages and looking at economic development subsidies and beginning to understand that what was going on with increasing the infrastructure in the tourist sector, downtown, and other economic development projects were pushing up property values, and we're making rents higher and making it more difficult for my clients. And yet this was what the city and the state were subsidizing, leaving it to the federal government to pick up the pieces, but the federal government just retrenching very much as far as that goes. Fast forward ahead to the foreclosure crisis, 2008, 2009, 2010, 2011. I am working at the place I'm working now, Partners for Dignity and Rights. And there, again, I was placed in a position where I was working with folks who had moved from Occupy Wall Street to something called Occupy Our Homes, and folks who are trying to keep homeowners from being foreclosed upon. And we had a situation here, again, where something is going on behind the curtain. And yet the focus was on the individual, just like the individual homeless guy. It was on the homeowner. Why did the homeowner take out this loan? How could they enter into a mortgage like this? That was impossible, and they knew it. And then pulling back the curtain and seeing, of course, that we had a secondary mortgage market that had expanded into essentially casino gambling, and which was not only packaging mortgages into securities, but then packaging those securities into other securities, and then even betting on what the price of those securities with various swaps, et cetera, as if they were port commodities. We at that time tried to push people towards, hey, we got a problem with housing finance. There's something called the fixed income security market, which is basically these securities like mortgages that if you invest in, you will, as an investor, get payments back over time, interest, dividends, whatever. It took 100 years for capitalism to get to $36 trillion in the fixed income security market. 100 years, and they reached that 36 trillion mark in 2000. Within 6 years, 2006, it had doubled. Today, it's gone up to $123 trillion. This is the fixed income security market. $123 trillion is about 33% more than what the world produces in GNP. Okay, so we have a lot of, we have surplus capital. We have a lot of money. The NPR once called it the giant pool of money that is circling the globe looking for investment. And this is a point I think that really, when I look back on this and say, how do we get here? There are so many answers, but the big one is because of financialization of housing. And the withdrawal of government from doing anything about that, quite frankly. The banks, as you know, got bailed out. We had Dodd-Frank. Now we have a homeless service industrial complex. My goodness, it's incredible what's happened in those years. We moved in. I started to work with a group called the Baltimore Housing Roundtable when we were doing this. That we went from the foreclosure work, and then I was working with them on human rights organizing and partnering with them, and they partnered in the 2015, I think 2016, with a labor union, Unite Here, who was organizing hotel workers, and this was they each had a common enemy, and it turned out to be a nice campaign. But in the process, I shouldn't say but while working on that, we really started to make the connection again between economic development that was going on, prices in real estate rising, workers not really getting the benefit or any public benefit to the economic subsidies that the city was giving hotels or downtown developers. And essentially, I remember the union leader saying, you know, we could get living wages, we could get prevailing wages on construction jobs, etc. But if the result of that is going to be on these projects, if the result of the project is going to be higher property values, then our members themselves will get pushed out of the city, and we're going to have a problem politically with our power in the city. Very interesting. And what emerged from this was a look at housing more in the context of development. And that's why that is my title now. I come from a development framework, and we try to deal with housing as part of a development framework, and shifting that development framework essentially to a community-driven development framework rather than a top-down development framework that benefits a few. And in Baltimore, what we came up with for this Fair Development Roundtable, joining with housing advocates, homeless folks, grassroots leaders, and a few labor unions, were principles of development, which I'm not going to get into now, right now, a structural analysis of development, and really a realization that we had to, whatever we did tactically, we had to understand these structures. And I've got about 8 minutes left or 7 minutes left. I'm gonna just look at two of these structures and just say, again, this is an answer of how we got here. And I'm gonna share the screen and show you some slides. I'm gonna look at two structures of three. There are three things that got us here. One is a fetishism around higher property values, which creates a political problem, a political power problem for those on the outside. Two is speculative capital, which I've talked about already. And three is continued racialized lending. But I'm not going to get into the lending so much now, but let me just deal with the slides for the first two. And I'll do slideshow. Here we go. I think, well, I don't know what you'll see, but nevertheless, I think you can see the slides, right? And this first slide is essentially what rising property values mean. And they mean city property tax revenue goes up, homeowner equity goes up, developer profit opportunities go up, as do investment capital profit opportunities and bank profit opportunities as well. But it also means that you're going to get increased rents and evictions, increased homelessness, higher property acquisition costs, increased risk of businesses and local business and elderly homeowner displacement, et cetera. I think we understand that. We also, I think we understand that this is not an either or, all right? The higher property values do have, this is not an evil, so to speak. The challenge here is how do you balance this and serve everybody? And how do you have a universal and inclusive development plan? And the difficulty in fighting for that, and this gets into political economy. because this is one thing I think that we learned very clearly in Baltimore. And that is that there is a very difficult political alliance, almost a holy trinity going on here. And at the top of it are the local politicians. And I know we have, I'm not painting all local politicians in this. We're talking about state and local politicians who have basically, they benefit from three things here. One is property tax revenue, which comes into the local development coffers when property values go up. They benefit from the votes of resident homeowners when home equity increases, and they also they benefit from the campaign contributions of what I would call the real estate industrial complex, the developers, the speculators, etc. So these rents, equity, and profits, that they all really combine so that you have homeowners, you have developers, and you have local politicians who actually are very much in favor of increasing property values. And again, that gets us to this problem right there. So that is one structural issue. The other structural issue, I'm going to skip to the next one. I'm not going to go to solutions to this because I'm just here to tell you the problem. I could go to solutions, but that's not my job right now. And that is the rise of speculative capital, which I've pointed out. And we're talking here about the little dots on this arrow are LLCs, limited liability companies. And in this case, I'm talking about those that are into bigger finances, like serial LLCs, et cetera. I don't want to really drill down too much on that. REITs are real estate investment trusts, statutory trusts, private equity. These are all entities that pool money together, and then they invest in real estate. And where do they invest? They invest in your community. They invest in Baltimore, they invest all over the world, and they're constantly, this giant pool of money is going into these entities. And that also has an impact on property values, as we know. So again, we have the increase in rents and possible homelessness and just property acquisition costs going through the roof, et cetera. And I just want to track back a little bit and look at where is the speculative capital coming from. Just a bunch of rich people who got excess in this giant pool of money? Well, no, yes and no. I mean, private pensions and retirement account investments. This is all this first tier up here. Public pension funds investments, even my son's, I looked at my son's college fund investments, and lo and behold, you know, like in that all that fine print, I see, oh my goodness, they're involved in some real estate here, insurance funds, mutual funds, and the second tier here is the entities that those receptacles, those pool capital entities, I would call them, the serial LLCs, the REITs, the real estate investment trusts, the statutory trusts, the private equity, and the fixed income securities. And these entities actually end up operating at your local level as limited liability corporations, limited partnerships, other corporate entities. And oftentimes it's very hard to find out who is behind the capital. So those are those are the slides. the brief account of my my trail, and I think to sum up how we got here, it's been essentially a financialization of capitalism, quite frankly, but very much a financialization of housing. A real political alliance around higher property values, to the and not a real good sense of how to balance that, and how to figure out to include folks who are being pushed out because of that. And essentially, yeah, that I think that's it. Those two big things, and a retrenchment with the public sector, whether it's the federal government, primarily the federal government, but also just a retrenchment by state and local governments too, which we can get into why that is philosophically. But I'm at 20 minutes and 42 seconds, and that is all I get. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Let's take a few short clarifying questions now. We'll hold comments for the discussion time, please. But Julie, do we have some questions? Julie, you're muted.
Okay, Steve, I think we had decided that we would take the questions after we heard from Kevin Foy so that we could do it all at once.
All right, then in that case, it is my pleasure to introduce former mayor of Chapel Hill and law professor at North Carolina Central University, Kevin Foy.
All right, thank you, Steve. And it's a pleasure to be here with everyone this beautiful spring afternoon in Chapel Hill. Before we start, I want to congratulate the Tar Heels on their spectacular win last night. And, you know, I know there are lots of us who are not necessarily Tar Heels fans and might be Duke fans, but it was a great game. And that is, and so I'm bringing that up for two reasons. The second one is that, you know, Hubert Davis, the first time I met him was at a land trust fundraising event. And that was before Hubert was even on the coaching staff. He's been a longtime supporter of affordable housing in Chapel Hill. And so, you know, he not only is he a great coach, but he's a great member of our community. All right, so I want to, oh yeah, and there's some Terps fans, and apparently there's more than just Duke and Chapel Hill fans in our audience. All right, so I want to talk about, can y'all see the slide? All right, just a brief history of Chapel Hill's recent experience. And by that, what I mean is my experience, my recollection of how Chapel Hill has evolved over time with our experience, with our understanding, with our efforts at dealing with affordable housing. And a lot of what Peter just said, I think, is resonates. And it's part of the experience that we've had. And I think that what that indicates is how much of a national problem affordable housing is. And some of the reasons are exactly what he touched upon. All right, so in the 1990s is when Chapel Hill and really Orange County established what was originally called the Land Trust. And the Land Trust was a quasi-public organization. It got quite a bit of funding from local governments, but it also got funding from the federal government. And its focus was on actually building housing. And so that was complex because building housing requires a lot of substantive knowledge. And also building housing can entail a lot of risk. And so that model became problematic because of all of those pressures that were put on the Land Trust, and it had financial problems and began to fail. And so that led to more of a discussion about, well, what should we as a community, by which I mean really Chapel Hill, Carrboro, and Orange County, do about what we saw as an increasingly intractable problem. because housing prices, even though this was the 1990s, I don't think it was any different. Housing prices were escalating, and we were encountering problems with the demographics of our community, by which I mean exclusion of people who couldn't afford to live here. One of the debates was about what is affordable. And I think that took up a lot of time and a lot of energy. What are the metrics around affordability, meaning how do you measure whether housing is affordable or not? And so there's this, there evolved, I think, this understanding that, well, it should be about 30% of your income, no more than 30% of your income should be devoted to housing, whether that's rent or mortgage and the attendant costs of maintaining a house, and that it had to be affordable to people who earned 80% of the median income. And so that's how we settled on the metric. Of course, then that all got difficult, got more difficult, because Chapel Hill's median income sometimes oddly reflects very low income people if you count the students, and so that was all a very muddled conversation for quite some time. And then there were these discussions about, well, what does it mean to have enough affordable housing? How do we know that we're actually being successful? And so that was a separate issue, which I think is also a separate issue. And that evolved into an acknowledgement that for affordable housing really to be successful, it has to be part of the fabric of the community and not sort of a marginalized place, so that it wouldn't be, oh, well, all the affordable housing is here, or these are the, or the affordable housing is here and here and here in identifiable and identified locations that maybe stigmatized people who lived there. So then the question became, well, how do you actually create neighborhoods that incorporate housing that's affordable into housing that's market rate? And that's what I mean by who's excluded from the housing market and why, and how does that, how do you address that? Early in the 1990s, I don't know exactly when this happened, because when I was elected to the council, this was the council policy, which was that 15% of all new housing should be affordable. And so once you got over the barriers of, well, what do we mean by affordable? Then you had this policy that this was what we wanted to achieve. The problem was the policy was unenforced, and it was questionable whether it could be legally enforceable. And so what that meant was acknowledgement of a problem, but not implementation of a solution. So the response to that lack of enforceability was the idea of using the town council's ability to make legislative decisions. Legislative decisions are discretionary, and zoning is a discretionary decision. So the council had the flexibility to refuse to rezone a parcel of property unless the developer was willing to meet certain conditions. And what the council began to do was to impose the policy as a condition. And that led to actually the 15% goal being met, but only if a developer needed special permission. We call it a special use permit. And actually that worked, to a certain extent. oops, sorry. Financing, as Peter alluded to, is a huge problem with regard to affordable housing. And one way that this was addressed was with the housing bond. Orange County and Chapel Hill worked together to put together a bond package in 2002 when Margaret Brown was the chair, and she initiated this affordable housing bond, which was a first for this county. And it gave the county the flexibility to actually allocate money to not only the land trust, but also, we still call it the land trust at the time, now it's the community home trust, but also to Habitat and Empowerment and other groups that were trying different approaches to providing housing at different price points. And also Chapel Hill's annual budget began to include some amount annually for various projects, including contributions to the Community Home Trust. But other things that Chapel Hill did that were meant to buttress support for affordable housing were, for example, the fare free transit system. Because one thing that we know is that if you can move around with minimal cost, which fare free transit provides to some extent at least, then you have more money to devote to other things like housing. There's a direct correlation there. We recognize that. And that was part of the impetus for fare-free housing, which continues today. The Home Trust also evolved over the course of, really now I'm talking about when I was the mayor, which was between 2001 and 2009. And the Home Trust moved from this model of building units and trying to actually be a housing developer into an organization that managed a large portfolio of housing in Chapel Hill, Carrboro, and to some extent the rest of the county. And that what we needed, because we were getting these commitments to affordable housing from developers, we needed somebody to manage the long-term affordability. And that became a key to success, because if you don't have long-term affordability of affordable housing, you can never expect to have affordable housing. All you do is, and we've seen this happen, is you essentially subsidize a first-time home buyer, and then the house immediately goes to market rate when that home buyer moves along. And so we tried to address that with the Home Trust. That led to financing issues, which is something that Peter's talked about too, which is that the Home Trust model of shared equity was problematic for lenders because they didn't get it and they weren't confident in it, and they don't like novelty when it comes to risking, their loans. So there were not just legal issues, as I said here. There were a lot of legal issues. Robert Dowling, who was the executive director at the time, focused on those and solved a lot of those in novel ways with some lawyers who were willing to commit their time and energy to that. Oops. One of the things that I think Chapel Hill recognized early on is the necessity and value of neighborhood participation, collaboration, participation, not just in how to deal with potential affordable housing, but participation in actually designing what would go where and how that would work, and learning about the value of good design, and also the equity of incorporating good, solid choices. like, for example, there was always pressure not to build sidewalks where there was affordable housing, which is what I mean by pressure to cut corners. You know, and this thinking was, well, that would save money and therefore the houses would cost less. But it also led to a disparity in providing amenities that really isn't acceptable. And so we tried to get community involvement and community participation so that people could think about that and be clear about who my neighbors are going to be and why I want to share our community with everybody, and why we don't want to have some people have a different experience in the community, like a neighborhood with no sidewalks or something like that. And you have to balance that with respect for the current neighborhoods and the history of those neighborhoods, and you know, why they are designed the way they are designed, and you know, all of that sort of thing that that is part of the balance that has to be achieved in neighbors being neighborly. Some of the issues associated with long-term affordability, which, as I said, and I don't think you can emphasize it enough, is it has to be affordable in the long term somehow, are the maintenance of the housing. So one of the things that the Home Trust had to confront was, because of the structure of ownership, it's a shared equity model. And that's how you maintain the long-term affordability. But if you share equity, then you have to share responsibility for maintenance. And a person who owns a house, but upon the sale of the house is going to share the potential increased value with someone else, might wonder why they should make 100% of the investment in a new roof, for example. So those kinds of issues also have to be addressed. And also another thing about maintenance of a home is the ongoing maintenance of insurance and taxes and that kind of thing. And especially in Chapel Hill, where the school tax is essentially the equivalent, maybe more, than the city tax. I mean, the tax that pays for police, fire, library, planning, you know, public works, everything. That's less of a burden on the taxpayer than the cost of schools. And so how do you balance that? The commitment in the community for devoting a lot of resources to the schools with, you know, affordability and long-term affordability of the housing. And then this fundamental tension that that Peter was explaining between affordability versus equity. And also a sort of an understanding in our society that a primary way to build wealth is through home ownership. And that's just a fact. It's not, you know, it's not necessarily good or bad. There's not a judgment about that, but it's a fact. Some of the other ideas that, you know, that we looked at that I still think are important considerations are affordable rentals, which is at the forefront right now. How can you approximate the kind of thing that the land trust was able to do, the community home trust was able to do over a 20-year period, you know, developing several hundred units? Not to say that that's enough, but that it was successful in that regard. How do you replicate that with rentals? And what do you do, for example, about commercial? You know, if you want there to be a real mix, a real dynamic, then shouldn't you be addressing not only who can live in the place, but also who can work in the place, because nonprofits or artist communities or whatever other endeavors might be beneficial to the community, but might be priced out of the commercial market. So those are also considerations that we attempted to address, but were not necessarily successful. So that's my brief history, as I recall it, of Chapel Hill's efforts over time. You're muted, Steve.
Steve, you're muted.
Okay, thank you very much, Kevin, for this capsule history of affordable housing attempts and successes and not such successes in Chapel Hill area. Julie, do we have some questions to ask of our two speakers? Julie, now you're muted.
Mute. All right, I'm looking now to see if we have questions. We'll just take a couple clarifying questions and then we'll get into the discussion. I want to ask everyone to place your questions in the Q&A. Is that the right place? And let's see if we've got any. We don't have any questions right now. I'm requesting people do that. We had also talked about the chat, so let's see if there's anything there. Peter Sabonis says he's a Maryland Terp. Well, I think that we heard a lot of ideas, and so I'd just like to pose a quick one. I know Hank Elkins is on the line, and he's participating, so I encourage Hank to enter this conversation because he's been very active in subsidized rentals, in the subsidized rental program. So I'm encouraging Hank to join the conversation. But I want to thank both Peter and Kevin. I think that this is really, really helpful to me to learn a little bit more about the financialization of what's happened to housing. And I wondered, Peter, if you could just say a little bit more about how it works. I mean, is it that the banks are only loaning for certain kinds of housing? Is it that the REITs have pooled all this money and it makes it so easy? But clearly what's happening in Chapel Hill is happening everywhere. Could you say a little more about that?
Yeah, there is the relationship between the banks and the what I would call the pooled capital entities, and I say pooled capital, I mean the places that gather money and investments, like the real estate investment trusts or the statutory trusts, or even private equity, and they are different from banks. Banks loan, and the banks invest too, given the changes that have gone on in our lending system. But in terms of housing, the banks play this role in lending, which is so important, whether you're doing market rate housing or you're doing affordable housing or deeply affordable housing. You're given our system, you're going to have to incur debt to develop. And I don't think that the issue so much with financialization of housing is about lending. There is another issue that's going on about lending, which I think that Kevin scratched at with the way lenders act in certain situations and with certain communities and certain actors, et cetera. But I do think that the financialization really with these REITs and these other entities is about it is about driving demand up, essentially. And you just have a lot of capital, a lot of power that is continually coming into the community, and can put together the equity that makes the lending very easy, can put together the projects that capture the attention of local politicians and the imagination of other economic development actors. And so, I think that's just an increase in those actors, an increase in the capital, and that is, it's funny because in Baltimore, most people say no, that doesn't go on here. No, that's New York, that's Boston, that's San Francisco, but we found that actually once you start pulling back it takes a while, pull back the curtain to the local LLC that you're dealing with, or the LLCs or the partners or whatever, and you and pull back the next curtain, and then you have to pull back the next curtain, and you find out, oh my goodness, there's some private equity funds that are involved in this. And the thing that blew my mind was a story about a guy I was trying to help out who was getting foreclosed upon because a private equity company had moved in, bought up a bunch of foreclosed houses, and we've heard about this in all sorts of places. But he was given this ultimatum of foreclosure or like a balloon predatory mortgage. He didn't have any money. He was disabled by that time. And we're trying to stave off foreclosure here. And the private equity company is getting investments from his mother's pension fund. She is dead. She was a public employee. Her money went into the pension fund. The pension fund put it into this private equity fund. The private equity fund put it into real estate. And now that money is pushing him out on the street. Just incredible. Just incredible.
Thank you, Peter. I have another one here from Fred Lampa, and I'll just go ahead and pose it. Why don't you take this one first, Peter? What are your ideas about how you can incentivize affordable rentals? And then maybe Kevin can take a crack at that too.
Yeah, that's a tough one. My position on this coming in was going to be, there are a number of tactical and tactical policy pieces and private pieces that you can do. But I'm not and just all I'm saying is like try to put them into the context of this broader matrix where, all right, that here we might be able to incentivize rentals by doing this. Okay, maybe a tougher inclusionary housing law, or maybe actually subsidies for developers, or mandates for developers, etc. But all of those are on a spectrum of effectiveness to non-effectiveness. But I guess what I was trying to go at with my presentation was like, as you do that, just also ask, okay, what is this doing in terms of the fetishism around higher property values, and more importantly, the political alliance around higher property values? What is it doing anything in terms of speculative capital? And is it doing anything in terms of the lending challenges that we have? So I'm gonna beg off a bit on that and just say I'm sure there are a number of good ideas, and I would just try to frame it bigger. And sometimes you're not going bigger. Sometimes you're just going to do one thing. But if I tell you this, if you could get those incentives paid for by speculative capital, you're starting to as I hate to say it, kill a few birds with one stone.
Steve, if it's okay with you, I think we've entered the question period, so we'll just keep going. Is that all right with you?
Sure, that's fine.
Okay, so Kevin, do you want to take a crack at that question, or should we move on?
Well, yeah, I mean, everything revolves around money, and you have to acknowledge that. And there are two aspects of it in this rental issue that's on the table right now. One is people have to make enough money in order to be able to afford anything. And so at root, we have a question of how our society compensates people. And, that's a big deal right now, as we all know nationally, because of the labor market. And over the last 40 years, wages have been depressed. And that's been a big contributor to this issue that we're talking about. The second one is on the supply side, which is, again, everything revolves around money. And so what you have to do, I think, is if you're going to have something approximating the community home trust, would have to be a community rental trust. And what you would do is eliminate the profit. And I think it's important that these actors be not governmental. I don't think that Chapel Hill or the federal government or the state should be operating the community home trust or a rental trust. I think it needs to be a non-governmental organization like that has different incentives than the government has.
Okay. So Hank Elkins has a question, which I kind of had invited him. He said, fair and affordable housing, ? We have a major problem in Chapel Hill and Orange County for people with justice involvement, imposition of blanket restrictions despite HUD's recommendation for a case-by-case determination. We see Seattle's success in fair housing. Is that a possibility? Peter, do you want to address that?
Are we talking about collateral consequences here of legal system involvement?
Let me see if I can bring Hank in. Let's see. Okay, Hank, I'm going to promote you to panelist, and maybe you could clarify your question. Hank, are you in?
Yes, indeed, Peter. We have people that are denied housing because even of misdemeanors, which may be 10 years old. And this is because it's obviously lots easier to do a background search now. And it's also easier to say, we don't want people living in our apartments who may have justice involvement, because it takes time and effort to look at individuals and see whether or not they might be appropriate. What have they done over the last 10 years to change their lives? And so time at the time, even with sufficient income, people are being denied housing here in Chapel Hill as they join the community coming out of prison. And it is a tough thing to see alternatives. Of course, we have the shelter, of IFC, and so on, and we have Oxford houses, but they nowhere meet the need of people who may have had misdemeanors or felonies in their background, even as long as 20, 30, or 40 years ago.
Thank you. So we made a special effort to reach out to a few discussants to think about. We're having no problems with having lots of questions. So we're going to try to get to them all. but any that we don't get to will be preserved as part of this recording. And we're going to put the recording out at the end in a few days after we're finished. And we'll put it in a blog post so that enable the conversation to continue on a blog. So I wanted to assure you of that. So Nancy Oates is a former council member. Nancy, are you still with us?
I am.
All right. Would you offer a bit of your experience while on the council and your thoughts about what you've heard today?
Yeah, I want to build on what Mr. Sabonis and Mr. Foy have said, that the challenges for affordable housing that we're seeing are ubiquitous. They're everywhere. They're everywhere that there are jobs, because that's where the speculative capital entities are investing. And these, I'm going to focus on private equity firms. Their goal is not to create housing, it's to create profits for their investors. And oftentimes those developments are going to be rental apartments because it's more density per acre, and then rentals because it's a whole lot easier to pass off rising costs to the tenant than when you've got a rental market. The other thing is, we hear a lot in Chapel Hill about the supply and demand. If we just increase the supply, of course, all of the rents would go down, but supply and demand works differently in housing than it does in any other market. In any other market, when the supply gets pinched, you have the choice of whether to not buy something or to postpone a purchase until the prices go down, till demand eases and the prices go down. But you can't do that with housing. You have to have a place to live. And when that happens, when we have so many luxury apartments buildings going up right now, what that does is raise the floor of the rents all over town. Because if you used to have $1,000 a month apartment, and now a bunch of $2,000 a month apartments are coming into the market, your landlord could raise yours to $1,200 a month, because that's still going to be affordable compared to the $2,000 that are coming up. So somebody who's in the $1,000 that now went up to $2,000 is going to go look for the $1,000 that they can afford. That's going to be the one that used to be $800. So it's putting a lot of downward pressure on the market. And then eventually the very low income people are getting shoved out. And that hurts us as a town, because people who are modestly paid for the services that we need, like the restaurant staff, pharmacy techs, teachers, firefighters, hospital maintenance workers, they can't afford to live in Chapel Hill. And if they have to commute a long ways, eventually they're going to find something, work that is closer to where they live. And we're seeing that now in Chapel Hill with, we've got labor shortages in pretty much every frontline category in town. And I wanted to talk a little bit about why Chapel Hill, even though we have council members who are very committed to the affordable housing problem, why they've been ineffective. And one of them is, one of the issues we have to keep in mind is that state law says that a municipality can't deliberately limit the profit of a private property owner, that the private property owner can make from his or her land. But the council does have some options. And one of them, Mr. Foy touched on, about the rezoning, that the town, anytime the town is considering rezoning a property for a higher value use, they can use that rezoning as a bargaining chip to get some kind of community benefits, such as affordable housing. The council can also work more with independent developers rather than some of the private equity firms. The council does have the inclusionary zoning ordinance, which is the 15% that Mr. Foy talked about. But we don't have a majority on council with the political will to turn down the tax revenue. For instance, if you have an apartment complex coming up and it's $80 million, and then you have, or you could back a more affordable unit that is is a $20 million project, the cost that the town pays for services is about the same. So the council is going to be predisposed to approve the $80 million project. What else here?
Those are helpful observations,
okay.
Nancy. So as we keep going through these questions, feel free to jump in.
Okay.
David Adams has a question, and maybe I could start with Kevin on this one. Why are development requests to upzone a property rarely refused?
Well, I think when the council makes a decision about whether to upzone a property, it's looking at what the potential trade-offs are, what the benefits are, and what the detriments are. And it could be that there are, tax benefits. I don't recall ever seeing any development that the council thought, oh, this would be great because we'll get a lot more revenue. Even things like Southern Village, which was an enormous development, was a net drain on the town's revenues for several years. Because there's so many investments that have to be made by the public. And so I think that when the council looked at whether to change the zoning, there were there were potential benefits, like, for example, instead of having 3 older buildings, you would get higher density in 2 newer buildings, and those newer buildings were in an appropriate location for example, the transit, on a transit corridor, or near downtown, or something like that. And I think one of the things that illustrates Chapel Hill's long-term idea about development overall is the urban growth boundary, the urban services boundary, which is still intact 40 years after the town put it in. I think you were on the council, Julie, when you did that. And what it did was drew a line around Chapel Hill. And it said, we're not going to grow outside this boundary. We're not going to sprawl. But the other side of that coin is, well, we're not going to stop growing. So we have to choose where we're going to grow, where we're going to accept greater density, and what that is going to look like. And so that's one explanation.
Okay. Anyone else on the panel like to address that? Okay, Jeff Green asks, and see who wants to take this one. Should Chapel Hill do something like SB 9 in California, which allows homeowners to split their lots and build a second house on the other half? We have a good number of large lots where this could be feasible. Strikes me that zoning may come in here a bit here, but anyone want to comment on that? Kevin?
Yeah, I would say that is precisely the kind of thing that requires a lot of participatory democracy. If you impose something like that on the town or on the community, I think it would lead to a lot of ill will. And I don't think that there's a one size fits all. One of the things that people like us who are not in elected office right now should recognize is that people in elected office spend a lot of time, and the result of that is they know a lot. They're very well versed in what's going on, and they tend to forget that not everybody knows what they know, because they spend hours and hours and hours. And so they know the minutia of many, many different things. Those of us who don't spend all our time doing this, it suddenly just happens. All of a sudden we hear, what? They're going to do what? Where'd that come from? And that has to be reconciled. The way that our elected leaders think, oh, okay, here's a really good idea, with those of us who are just citizens. And we need time to absorb these ideas and think about them and understand what the effect will be. So it could be a good idea, but it's a bad idea unless you spend time with communities and think it through in a participatory way.
Thank you.
If I might add to that, can I get something there?
Sure.
I didn't get into our fair development principles, but I do think that there are a lot of communities, a lot of cities who have adopted, especially in the last 2 or 3 years, equity guidance, equity principles, racial equity lenses, etc. In Baltimore, we did our coalition before that set up a principled guide to development. It's not like the city adopted this, but those principles, 3 of the principles were essentially universality, which means meet everybody's needs, everybody's fundamental needs, not just those of a few. Equity, which really meant understand that everybody started from a different place, but they need to end up in the same place. And then 3 things that I think that really get into what Kevin was just talking about. Another principle was participation, people participation, and partnering with that, another principle, transparency. And finally, another principle, accountability. Okay, so, regardless of where people stood on universality and equity, when it came to participation, transparency, and accountability, I couldn't tell you how. I mean, it was amazing how all sides came together on that. Public participation, public transparency, and accountability.
Thank you. So, Councilmember Adam Searing has a question, and this is, I think, for you, Peter. Can someone give a specific example of how an investment fund interest distorts the market?
It doesn't distort the market. I mean, and that is the issue. No. Everybody, this is like the market is working perfectly. There's nothing wrong with the market. Everybody is pursuing profit. And if you pursue that, this is the way the invisible hand operates. Okay, there's no distortion of the market here. There's just no equity. There's no inclusion. This is the problem that we have with the market, and so I would say no, it doesn't distort the market. It distorts the outcomes and the justice and the inclusion that we would like in our social, economic, political, cultural environment.
And I mean, just to add to what Peter said, the society that we live in embraces this. Anyone who owns a home knows that you have equity in the home, that the home you've built equity. And part of it is your investment, and part of it is the potential increased value. And that doesn't only have to do with homes, it has to do with real property. I mean, I remember when we were looking at a potential development that would be an old family homestead. And the argument of the family was, this is our legacy. This is what we inherited. The value of this property is what our parents built and gave us. So it's the world we live in, and it's not all evil, but it's reality.
Thank you. So I think we have time for a final question, then we'll do a wrap up. But Virginia Faust asks, are there any communities in North Carolina which have successfully implemented programs to address their affordable housing issues? Should it be likely, easier, more successful in small, medium, and large jurisdictions? Why or why not?
I'm gonna defer to those folks who are more familiar with the local environment.
Okay, Nancy or Kevin?
Well, there was one that council members saw in Boulder, Colorado, and that had to do with a mixed income investment. Part of it was market rate and part of it was subsidized. And the people in Boulder Housing were very successful in getting whatever subsidies they needed. They said they would work with town staff. I urged town staff to talk with them. I don't know that town staff ever followed up, and I'm not sure why, but it has been done in other communities. We just need to tap their brains.
Okay, so I think it's time to wrap up. I can't say that I can come up with the distillation of where our community needs to go with affordable housing, but I think our speakers have done a superb job at describing how we got to where we are, looking at the national picture, the financialization of housing industry, and how sometimes the goals of a town to attract the tourists and make things up the property values often goes the other way in terms of it has a deleterious effect on our housing stock. And that was very helpful to me to hear about that. And it was also good to be refreshed by Kevin about kind of where we started, which was in the beginning, we didn't have any affordable housing efforts at all. And it was just interesting to hear the history again, going back to the 90s. So I'm going to pass it off to Linda now, who's really the architect of this program, and maybe she has some final thoughts and also maybe wants to share with you what's going to happen next time.
Thank you, Julie. I think that with this conversation that we've had, we all have a better understanding of how and why the crisis of housing affordability was created. And maybe all of us can start thinking about how this problem might be solved. I hope that you will be able to join us next week, because people all around this country have solved this problem from the bottom up, not from the top down. And next week, you'll have the opportunity to hear about some of the creative and inspiring successes that community groups have had by using various methods and strategies to overcome these obstacles that you've heard about and create an assortment of housing types, several of which also provide a variety of services to residents, so that when you have that person who have become an alcoholic, for example, you're not sure about whether that person or you're not comfortable with that person living in your community, there are wraparound services to support that person. So next week, you'll hear about some of these things. And thank you for joining us. And until we see you next week, be safe and be well.
And thank you to our speakers. Peter, very much. That was very instructive. And thank you, Kevin. That was excellent. And Nancy, thank you.
Thanks.
I think we've arrived at the end.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Until we meet again.
Okay.